Greetings, students. Tonight is another time to look at video lecture. So we're going to spend a little time tonight talking about how policy is made. So bear with me as we get started. So first of all, we're in a social welfare policy class, so it's really important for us to understand the dynamics, the ins and the outs of all of the things that actually go into and impact and affect policy. So keeping in mind, number one, that policy is a government product, so it's what legislators do. They sit, they study, they research issues, and they then are charged with making decisions around policy and the use of taxpayer dollars for various policy endeavors. Technically, the policy should always reflect the interests of the citizens in a democratic society. And public policy in the U.S. is a deliberative process that involves two bodies of elected officials in the form of a legislature, federal and state level, with the exception of Nebraska, which is unicameral. They only have one particular house. So, of the tens of thousands of bills presented to Congress at any given time, a mere 10% survive committee, and then another 5% become law. So as you can see, there's a lot of weeding out in terms of what happens at the bills, long read processes, and in your textbook there is a diagram that really illustrates how bills are presented, how they're passed, how they go to committee, whether they fail, when they fail. It's a very intense process of back and forth that really determines, which is why I think that the rate of bills that are actually passed, this 5% to become law, is actually so small. So when we think about this, if policy reflects the concerns of a group of citizens while neglecting others, is ultimately a question of power and influence. So again, policy in its truest form will do two things. It will be beneficial to certain groups of people or certain folks, and for others it will be not as beneficial or actually detrimental in some instances. So that's just the nature of how social policy works. And so the job of legislators is to really look at doing the work they need to do to come up with policies that have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of promoting the most good for the most people. That's theoretically intended how it's supposed to work. But then you need to think about, as social workers, what does this mean for you in terms of your role? If you are charged with providing services to those who are often less fortunate in our society, then they don't typically have a voice. So what is our role as social workers? What should we be doing? Something for you to ponder and think about. So some other things that came out of the readings that maybe we didn't know is that the Congress and the legislature employ technical experts on various issues, and these experts assist on research and decision making. So they don't make totally uninformed decisions as it relates to various pieces of legislation and what they're trying to do, because they have access to technical expertise to really have people who have some level of expertise and knowledge about the particular issues that they're addressing, and they give them the best benefit of their best research in terms of that. So keeping in mind that research is an important thing. There's an overview of the entitlement programs, or green book, that's used by the U.S. House and Ways Committee to consider for consideration for social programs. So there's a text that really looks at what's all available, how they got to some of those decisions, and it's referred to supposedly often. And in 2014, a research report analyzed 1,779 policies between 1981 and 2002, and here's what they found. It was heavily tilted towards corporations, businesses, professional association, with the favors of the advantaged elite. So when policies do finally make it out of that 5%, it looks like corporations and businesses and professional associations are typically the beneficiaries and not so much the people. So we've had this process that happens also in this whole policy-making decision that really looks at social stratification, that really looks at the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. There's a table on a 172 to really help you think about which group you find yourself in. There are also tables on 175 and 174 that talks about PACs, political action committees that have been recently brought on the scenes that are money-making machines, or should I say money producing machines for a number of different politicians and legislative body folks. Lobbying, and they spend that money trying to persuade legislators to vote in the favor of the organizations which they represent. So the lawmakers rely on the experts to assess the social conditions and develop policy opinions. So we have these think tanks, conservative and liberal, that researchers and senior fellows just really take a deeper policy look at those particular issues and then make recommendations based on what they think the outcomes will be. The legislation is proposed by committee members who rely on experts or the lobbyists, former staffers who represent special interest groups. There's a YouTube clip video here that I will make available for you all that really talks about the PAC committees and some of the things that they're actually doing. So as this process continues, there's this implementation which requires authority, personnel, funding to accomplish the stated task. The episodic nature of public support for social welfare programs makes implementation difficult. So it doesn't happen very often, but on occasion, those particular issues do come up, and there is support for some social welfare programming, but it doesn't come up a lot. So most of the other pieces of legislation have to do with other aspects of running this country, and not so much with the social welfare piece. And so again, they're having to really look at the entire totality of what they're trying to accomplish in terms of if we pass this legislation, what's it going to cost, how are we going to fund it, how are we going to evaluate it, how are we going to know whether it's getting done. And then there's an evaluation done by the GOA, the Office of Management and Budget, the OEMB, the CRS, and the Congressional Budget Office. So there are a bunch of folks who sit around and crunch numbers to really take a look at what it would take to affect the kind of change needed and how expensive bills actually are. There's another piece that goes into this whole decision making around policy, and that's the bureaucratic rationality. Also looking at market rationality. So there are a couple of different venues that people kind of enter into. Market rationality is centered around the rules of supply and demand, distributing goods and services. Capitalist organizations survey the market, goods, services, and shape consumer preferences and reduce competition, and not responsive to those who don't fully participate, i.e. minorities, women, kids, the poor, disabled, and elderly. So as you can see, when we start to look at rationales for why policy moves the way that it does, these are important factors that we need to make ourselves aware of. The bureaucratic rationality refers to ordering of social affairs by government agencies. So really looking at the welfare of civil servants and the other folks who are going to be impacted by these social problems. So they get defined and they help develop solutions. So those are the two rationales that policies usually have to run through before there's a determination made about whether they will work or not. And then we get into advocacy. So again, we know that as social workers, it's a part of our code of ethics that we involve ourselves in advocacy efforts, and these are a few of the national advocacy organizations and foundations that work on behalf and spend quite a bit of time up on the Hill in terms of really looking at advocating for the needs of social welfare. So the Children's Defense Fund, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, Economic Policy Institute, the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and New America Foundation Center for American Progress. And the other thing that doesn't really help our situation is that when we start to think about social workers being active in macro politics and in the legislative process, there are only 5 in that whole national offices with MSW. So yes, you can see we have a long way to go in terms of really trying to have the kind of numbers that impact the kind of positive change that we need. So that's really kind of in a nutshell the policy piece. So I encourage you to go back and do your readings. But as you can see, it's a pretty interesting and complex process. And so, we wonder why it takes so long for things to get done by government. And part of the rationale, or part of what you can extrapolate from this exercise, is that there's so many processes and lenses and people who have to touch this process. And then there's the influence of money, that all kind of drive what the outcomes actually are. And then, as you can see from some of the research, that even in the best of circumstances, the majority of policy still tends to lean in the favor of corporations and big business. So we've got a lot of work to do, and just wanted to make sure that you were aware that we had a pretty good, clear understanding of how policy actually works. So please do your readings, and we'll talk more in our Zoom lab classes.